Hello everyone and greetings from Germany. I've heard more and more often that people are asking about, I have a Helix now, but I still want to use my amp, and what's the best way for me to do this? Should I use 4cm? Should I go through the FX loop? Should I just go through the front input? And so that's why I decided to make this video. I want to show you that you can cable your amp for 4cm and just leave it that way, and you still have the ability, because the Helix is so flexible, to use it in 3 different modes. So that's what this video is going to show you. So the first thing you need to understand is, once you have connected the Helix to your amp, whatever it may be, for 4cm, that's only half of the battle, because what goes on inside each device is certainly as important, if not more important, than how you have cabled them, because the Helix and your amp both have certain abilities that you need to understand. So let me start off right now by showing you how to connect, or how to enable, a pure 4cm operation between the Helix and your amp using the FX loop of your amp. So here you see I have a brand new preset. I haven't done anything with it yet. In order to use 4cm with the Helix, and by the way, this is also true for the HX effects, you need to have an FX loop. And by the way, I don't mean a send and return, I mean an FX loop. So I choose FX loop 1. Okay. So now if I look here, I have an input, I have an FX loop, and I have an output. Let's test how that works. If my 4cm is working properly, I should hear the differences between the 4 channels on the amp 1, because that's what 4cm allows you to do. So you can see right now that I have switched to the modern channel, which is a high gain channel. Let's see how that sounds. Sounds kind of high gain to me. If I turn off the overdrive and I go to the clean channel, it should sound very different. And it does. Okay, so that means I know that I have 4cm working. So one big reason we do 4cm in the first place is that it allows us to put some effects in front of the preamp of the amplifier, and some of the effects after the preamp and before the power amp. And so in order to show you that this is actually what I'm able to do, there's the FX loop block. I added a compressor, I added a kinky boost, I added a simple delay, and I added a chamber reverb, just for fun. Okay, so now let's see how that works. Okay, everything's working as it should. If I push this button here, which puts me into overdrive mode, I'm again on my high gain channel. Okay, so 4cm is working fine. You could go from here and add your effects and do everything you want to do. Note that I am not using MIDI at this moment to control the amp 1, the channels on the amp 1, or anything else. I'm just using that overdrive button to show you the difference between the sound of the different channels. If you don't have this FX loop here, okay, and this is very important for the next part, If you don't have this FX loop here, if I disable it, guess what? No matter what I do, I don't hear any difference because I'm bypassing the preamp. Without the FX loop, I'm bypassing the preamp, and this output is going directly to the FX return of my amp 1. So this is feeding directly into the power amp. And that leads me to my second option. So let's say that you have your system set up for 4cm and you like to use the preamp on your amplifier, but you also like to use the preamp blocks on the Helix. You did pay for them and they're all there, so why not use them? So what you see now is that I have turned off the FX loop block. Remember I said if you turn off the FX loop, you're only feeding the power amp of the amp 1 or whatever amp you're using, because this connection is going to the FX return of your amp. So what I've done here is I have put in the block of a preamp that I really like, which is the Princess. I still have my effects turned on, although I turned off the Kinky Boost. And so that allows me to mix and match. I can use 4cm and use the preamp section of my amplifier, or I can use any preamp that I want. I strongly suggest if you have a tube power amp that you use the preamp models of the Helix and not the full amp model, because with the tube power amp, the preamp models will really, in my opinion, sound a lot better. Okay, so let's say I decide I want to use a different preamp. So these are my three favorites that I've stored so far, and see how that works. Okay, so at this point I'm only using the power amp of my amplifier, but I have not changed my cabling at all. It's still exactly the same. And it's just because I turned off that FX loop. If I turn off this preamp, I'll be right back where I was before. Aha, you see? The preamp on the amplifier is now back in the game because I turned this FX loop back on. But if I disable the FX loop and re-enable my preamp, that is the Helix preamp and not my amplifier's preamp. So that allows me to mix and match between one preset and another, or even within the same preset, because I can toggle these two blocks. I was doing that before. I can toggle these blocks so that the preamp is on and the FX loop is off, or the other way around. And so I can literally switch back and forth between full 4cm and power amp only. Now let's assume that you want to use your amp 1 or your tube amp and your Helix together, but you want to use it old school. In other words, you want to feed all the effects and everything right into the front input of your amp. You don't even want to use the FX loop. Well, that's a challenge on many amps that have a serial FX loop, because once you have plugged a 1/4-inch jack into the FX loop of your amp, it breaks the connection between the preamp section and the amp section, because it absolutely expects a signal to be coming in and then going back out again. So you need to find a way around that. So there is a way to do that. One way that I figured out is that you turn off the FX loop on your amplifier. So I had an amp that on a foot switch you could assign FX loop on and off. I never really knew why I would want to do that until now, but now I know why. With the amp 1, there is no way to turn on the FX loop on and off except through MIDI. And that's why I have a MIDI command in this preset now. And so let me just show you what I mean by that. In the command center of the Helix, this foot switch is assigned to CC40, which is a CC toggle, because I want to toggle the FX loop on and off. And it just so happens that on the amp 1, the FX loop is CC number 40, with a minimum value of 0 and a maximum value of 127. Okay? So your amp may be different, but if you are using an amp 1, that's how you would do it. That's the first step. The second step is you need to get a signal into the front input of your amp. And we just turned off this FX loop, and we just turned off the FX loop on the amplifier. How do I get a signal into the front input of this amp? And by that, I mean right here. Well, if you think about how 4cm works, the FX send on the Helix goes to the main input of the amplifier. So if I put just a send, this is only a send, it's not an FX loop, it's just a send, then whatever goes out of send 1 will go to the front input of my amp. But I need to turn that off because that will send the signals to the wrong places, and that's not what I want. And I need to turn off the FX loop on my amplifier, because if there's no signal here, I won't hear anything. If you don't believe me, let me show you. See, that's not good. You don't want that. But if I have an FX send here, I'm simply going in as if I had no FX loop at all on my amp. And it works exactly as you would expect. Okay, the preamp has full effect, just as you would expect it to do. So, I hope this has helped you, because this allows you to connect your Helix to your amp with 4cm and leave it there all the time, regardless of how you want to use your amp. And there may be situations where you only want to run that input through the front of the amp. Other situations where you want to mix and match between the preamp or the amp models of the Helix with the preamp section of your own amp. And this way you can do all three. And I did not change a single cable. The only thing I needed to do, because of the amp 1 and how it works, was I needed to use a MIDI command to turn off the FX loop on the amp 1 itself. So I hope this is useful information, and it will help you get more out of your Helix, which is so versatile. It can do everything, or almost everything. So have a great day, and I'll see you later.